Hi,
Hi.
you're in your office?
Yeah. And I faced my outside window so I could not have light behind me.
Oh, nice, smart.
It's funny. This is the way the office was set up when I first arrived in Norwalk. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to have my back to the door. So I've turned around ever since.
Well, for once in a while, it's different than all the time.
Right. Totally. Ilana.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to see you.
Thank you, you too.
The kids get to bed?
Some of them. Hopefully they won't make an appearance.
Okay. Good. Whatever.
Wait, oh, my video's not on. Sorry about that. Hold on. Let's see if I can get it on.
Yeah, there you go.
See. Oh, you see me. I don't see me. That's weird.
Oh.
Let's see. I wonder why I don't see myself.
What are you viewing? Like, what's your view?
I see a flyer and I see you.
Oh. You have gallery view selected?
Let me see if I can do that. Hold on. Let's see. 1 second. Let's see. How do I do that? Side by side gallery. Let's try that. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect.
Rockin'.
Thank you.
Oh, good. So Ilana, meet Danielle Middleman. She's our education director and director of community engagement.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
So she'll
Lovely
be
to have you.
Thank you for having me. Great. I'm just going to open the window because we have a heat wave here. 1 second.
Nice.
How hot is it?
Oh, I don't know. It's very hot. I can't tell you more than that, but it's quite hot. And tomorrow's supposed to be hotter. So yeah, yes, I don't exactly know because I don't have my, anyway, it's hot.
Okay. We're up to 63 here, and that feels pretty good given the last couple of days.
Right. It's all relative. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would say, yeah. It must be in like
shorts today.
Yeah. No, it must be in the, I'm guessing in the 80s, but I don't know. It feels quite hot.
Wow.
But I don't really know. Anyway.
All right. Well, we'll give folks several more minutes to join us. It's not even
okay. Great.
Yet. Hi, Bob. Hi, Barbara. Hello, Wendy. And Sue, I see you signed on before I did. Hi. Okay, I'm just going to turn off my video for a couple of minutes. I have a couple other things to prep here. I'll be right back.
Ellen's getting off the phone soon. We were at a bar mitzvah in Canada via Zoom, of course.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hi.
Hi, Jim.
How
Hi.
are we?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Dad.
Hi.
Oh, hi, Deb.
Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hello, Sherman.
How you doing, Robert?
Good, good. It's a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Right, right. There you go. I got my sweater on.
We got our guest that's on the Zoom call with us, Ilana.
Yes.
Good morning, good afternoon, shalom.
It's nighttime for Ilana. She's in Jerusalem.
I know she's at Jerusalem. So she's ahead of us, right, in time? 7 o'clock?
Yep, 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, okay.
Time to go to bed.
Perfectly reasonable hour.
Time to go to sleep.
Time to get ready for bed.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Laura.
Welcome,
Marvin.
everybody, as you're coming on. Great to see you.
You want to say we're just finishing lunch? We'll go video in a while.
Sure, when you're becoming a rabbi.
Hey, Marvin.
But luckily, I'm not becoming a rabbi, so you know. We're just,
If you grow a beard, I'll be really nervous.
right?
You would make a great rabbi. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, that's not the point they were making. Thanks, Jim. I love you too.
Well, I love you as well, so.
Oh my goodness, Louise. Hello. Oh, so glad you joined. This is great. You're on mute, but your smile is not. There you go.
Had a particular interest because my son Jonathan is starting a new novel about somebody who's interested in Talmud.
Well, there you go.
Hi, Louise. You know, I was going to call Steve
Hi.
for a while. And how you guys doing? Last time I tried to reach you, you were on the other side of the world.
We had a good winter.
Good. Steve doing okay?
Steve is fine.
Good. Give my regards. I'll give him a call later.
Bob Gordon. I just told him who was on.
Oh, okay.
Hey,
Hey,
Steve.
Steve.
Hi. Thank you so much for that birthday note. It felt really nice coming from you.
You are most welcome. Happy birthday.
We can do it again
it's so
next
nice to
year.
see all of you here.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to put myself on mute because I'm eating my lunch breakfast.
All right, Gloria. B'tei avon.
Okay.
Be there to share.
All right,
That'd be
everybody.
very good.
We're good. I'm going to take down the welcome screen. So now we can all see each other. And if you haven't yet shared your video and are decent enough to do so, you're welcome to. So we're not all looking at a screen of black. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the second annual William Grossman Memorial Lecture or Memorial Study Program. We still haven't settled on the appropriate title because it's only the second year, but we're very, very pleased to be hosting this. Those who knew Bill of blessed memory will attest to his passion for Jewish learning, and particularly, as I understand, for a passion for heated disagreement, shall we say, for the sake of heaven. And I'm just going to share my screen one more time here because we have a beautiful picture. Oh.
Oh, that's it, yeah.
Oh,
Thanks, Bob.
Yes, thank you, Bob, for sharing this picture of the Millionaires dating back to 2006.
That's way
And if
back.
you really want to understand how long ago it was, just take a look right here. For were little Lily, little Neely, and little Dory, and they're not so little anymore. We can understand that time has passed. But of course, here's Bill right in the center. As I understand, the life of the minion conversation. So we'll unshare there. We want to thank so much Wynn and Stephanie Baum for generously sponsoring today's study program in honor and in loving memory of Bill Grossman. And so the format for today is as follows. Ilana Kurshan, our guest teacher, is going to teach for 45 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. And once she begins speaking, I'm going to drop a link to her source sheet in the chat. And if you'd like to follow along with the actual text of the traditional sources that she'll reference today, you can open that up. But she won't be screen sharing or anything. She's just going to be speaking to us, I believe. And if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can either chat them to everybody and I'll ask them when the Q&A arrives, or you can chat them directly to me and I will ask them when the time arrives. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guest teacher. Ilana Kurshan is the author of If All the Seas Were Ink, published in 2017 by St. Martin's Press. She's translated books of Jewish interest by Ruth Calderon, Benjamin Lau, and Micha Goodman from Hebrew to English, as well as novels, short stories, and children's picture books. Her book, Why Is This Night Different from Other Nights, was published by Shokin in 2005. She's a regular contributor to Lilith magazine, where she's the book reviews editor, and her writing has appeared in The Forward, The World Jewish Digest, Hadassah, Nashim, Zeke, Kveller, and Tablet. Ilana Kurshan is a graduate of Harvard University, where she received a BA summa cum laude in history of science. And she's a graduate of Cambridge University, where she earned her Master's of Philosophy in English Literature. She lives in Jerusalem with her husband and her 5 children, who we hope will all be asleep by the end of this program, if they're not already now. Without further ado, I'm going to ask those who are not yet on mute to mute yourselves, and we'll turn it over to Ilana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Paskin, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to study with you today and to honor the memory of Mr. William Grossman. So thank you very much. So not all that long ago, shortly after the coronavirus pandemic began, I began studying the section of the Talmud known as Tractate Shabbat in Daf Yomi, which is a worldwide program to read through the entire Talmud at the rate of a page a day, which takes 7.5 years. You might say that I began this tractate about Shabbat, the day of rest, as I gradually realized that people around me, and indeed people all over the world, were being asked to accept upon themselves an extended period of resting and retreating and desisting from many forms of labor. Here in Israel, where I live, the Ministry of Health issued increasingly stringent guidelines every few days regarding the extent to which we were allowed to leave our homes and to engage socially. So it was first no gatherings of over 100, which then became no gatherings of over 20, which then became no minyanim, no unnecessary social interaction with anyone outside of one's family. Schools were shuttered, then the restaurants and the malls were closed, and then we were told not to leave home unless absolutely necessary. And so it was while increasingly confined to the private domain of my home that I learned the first chapter of Tractate Shabbat in the Talmud, which begins with a discussion of the limits placed on our interactions with people outside our homes. Now, in the Torah, one of the defining features of Shabbat is the injunction to stay put, and I quote you from the book of Exodus, "Mark that the Lord has given you Shabbat, let everyone remain where he is, let no one leave his place on the 7th day." And one of the 39 labors prohibited on Shabbat is that of carrying an object from one domain to another. So the rabbis of the Talmud explain that it's prohibited to carry from the public, from any place in the public domain, like say the city square, to the private domain of one's home and vice versa. As the reality of this pandemic increasingly set in, I realized that each time I left my home, I was potentially carrying germs that could infect those around me. And each time I returned home from outside, I was potentially carrying germs that could infect my family. I found myself fearing that I might unwittingly be a carrier, and that no amount of hand washing or sanitizing would save the people I love or the communities I'm a part of from the threat of contagion. The opening pages of Tractate Shabbat describe a series of hypothetical interactions or exchanges between a poor man who's standing outside a house and the homeowner who's inside. The rabbis ask, may the poor man reach his hand into the house so that the homeowner might place food in his basket. May he take food out of the homeowner's hand on Shabbat. That is, to what extent are we permitted to engage with those around us who might need our help or who might be able to help us? I've thought about this question a lot over the course of the past year and a half, as I've tried to, quote unquote, reach out to friends in far more difficult situations than my own. Single moms isolated at home with young kids, unmarried friends living alone, an elderly friend confined to her assisted living facility. It's more difficult to make contact without contact, but I've been learning how to extend my proverbial basket. During the first month of our lockdown, my son, my oldest child, who is now 10, taught me how to host a Zoom meeting. My twin girls davened with their first grade teacher on WhatsApp video, and I called a few friends I hadn't spoken with in months because suddenly they seemed no further away than my neighbor down the block. I would like to be able to extend a real hand, but as we all know, the coronavirus is transmitted rampantly when people use their hands and touch surfaces that have been contaminated. The Talmud teaches in the beginning of Tractate Shabbat that hands are considered ritually impure because they are preoccupied. That is to say, they tend to touch dirty or impure objects. That is, our hands are not ours alone because they bear the traces of everything in the public domain that we as private individuals have touched. Now, Tractate Shabbat is 24 chapters long, and when you learn it in Daf Yomi at the rate of a page a day, it takes about 4 months. I remember back in January, February, when the pandemic began, I was sure that by the time we finished the tractate, this whole mess would be behind us. But now, a full 3 tractates later in Daf Yomi, that hope has proved illusory. The pandemic has continued, but on the other hand, so has my daily Talmud study. And the reason I'm sharing all this with you today is because it's a somewhat recent example of how the Talmud page I study every day has informed so much of my daily experience, and how my daily experiences have deepened my understanding of the text of the Talmud, which I've been studying now for, wow, I guess it's been about almost 15 years. Well, 14 years. Yeah, 14 years. When I first started learning Daf Yomi, no, over a decade ago, it wasn't because I imagined that the Talmud would speak to me so personally, and really not even because I had any particular interest in Talmud. It was really more of a coping mechanism than anything else. At the time, I was going through a difficult period in my life. I was getting divorced, living alone in Jerusalem, thousands of miles from my family and closest friends back in New York. And I remember I was very depressed. Time seemed to stretch ahead of me inexorably, and I was convinced that with every passing day, I was just going to get one day older. The only thing that got me out of bed in the mornings was that I had a friend I used to go jogging with. And one morning, my friend mentioned to me that she had begun studying Daf Yomi, and she suggested that I try it too. Now, I remember I looked at her like she was totally crazy. I had heard of Daf Yomi. I knew that it meant daily page of Talmud. That is, I knew that it referred to this international program to complete the entire Babylonian Talmud in 7.5 years, learning 1 page every day. But I could not conceive of that. 7.5 years. My marriage had just fallen apart. I was in no position to make any sort of long-term commitment. I wouldn't even sign a lease on an apartment for more than 6 months because I was so uncertain about where I was going to end up. Not to mention that I couldn't imagine wanting to study all that Talmud. At the time, I had studied some Talmud before. I went to a Salman Schechter school through the 8th grade. I thought of the Talmud as a dry legal code with a complicated, convoluted logic. I was very put off by what I perceived to be the misogyny of the Talmud. Most of the women who were mentioned in the Talmud are either some rabbi's wife or daughter. Right? Very few of the women have identities independent of their fathers or spouses. And then there is just the sheer massiveness of the text. The Babylonian Talmud is comprised of some 2,700 pages, divided into 37 volumes known as masechtot, tractates. Each of those tractates are further subdivided into chapters. And as I was thinking about all this, about all these reasons why it would be crazy, if not inconceivable, for me to embark on such a project, my friend, my running partner, stopped me, and she said something I never forgot. She said to me, Ilana, you're feeling completely stuck right now. Don't you think that maybe if you learned 1 page of Talmud a day, then eventually a new chapter would begin for you too? And I thought about that. I thought, wow, if every day I learned 1 page of Talmud, say, then with every passing day, I wouldn't just be 1 day older, I'd be 1 day wiser. And very soon I began to realize that, that's really the Jewish view of time. The rabbis teach in Pirkei Avot, in the ethics of the fathers, a part of the Mishnah, ben chamesh lamikra, ben eser lamishna, ben chamesh esrei latalmud. At age 5, a person should begin studying Mikra, Bible. At age 10, you begin learning Mishnah. At age 15, you should begin studying Talmud. Now, at that point in my life, I was almost twice the age stipulated for beginning to study Talmud. But as we learn elsewhere in Pirkei Avot, if not now, when? And so I decided that I would begin learning Daf Yomi and see if maybe a commitment to learning a page of Talmud every day might pull me forwards, kind of like being on a treadmill where you just keep going because you can't stop. Well, that's sort of what happened. What I discovered about the Talmud really surprised me. I very much got swept up in it because unlike later works that followed from it, the Talmud, it's not a law code that tells Jews how to behave. It's really a record of rabbinic conversations in which many of the questions are left open and unresolved. It's a text for those who are living the questions rather than for those who have found the answers. And unlike the Talmud I had studied in my Salman Schechter school, where we were generally presented with quoted passages cut and pasted onto source sheets, I found that studying Talmud in context, page after page after page, was a completely different experience. I was working at the time as an editor for a literary agency. I was always thinking about questions of structure, literary coherence, and I was fascinated by how the stream of rabbinic consciousness unfolded in the Talmud, proceeding associatively rather than rationally. And so I would follow along as the text meandered from a discussion of how cheese is curdled to why Torah scholars are like fragrant perfume to what happened once in a town that had a scarcity of bakers. All that is on 1 page in Tractate Avodah Zarah, just to give an example of how discursive the Talmud is. And yes, there were topics that I found less interesting than others, but there was something that caught my eye on nearly every page, that is to say every day, whether it was a folk remedy employed to heal an ailing sage, a rude insult leveled at one rabbi by another, a sudden interjection from a rabbi's angry wife. I found myself really carried along for the ride. tossed about like a rough wave when the rabbinic argumentation became particularly stormy. And early in my learning, I came to a story that helped me make sense of the effect that all this Talmud study I was doing was having on me. I put it on your source sheet. It's the first source, but you don't need to have the source sheet in front of you. It's more, the source sheet is really in case you want to go into anything I did. I covered in more depth afterwards, but I'll mention when I touch upon those sources. It's a story about an encounter between a wise sage, Rabbi Yehoshua, and the daughter of the Roman emperor. Rabbi Yehoshua was a great scholar of Torah, but he was also, we know, a very ugly man. And the daughter of the Roman emperor took one look at him and said, "How can such great and beautiful wisdom be contained in so ugly a vessel?" Now, Rabbi Yehoshua, the ugly vessel for beautiful Torah, came right back at her with a question of his own. He said to her, "Does your father, the emperor, does he store his wine in clay vessels?" And she said, well, of course, everyone does. And Rabbi Yehoshua said to her, but he's the emperor. Shouldn't he store his wine in the finest gold vessels? She acknowledged that he had a point, and she transferred all the imperial wine stores to gold vessels, where, of course, it spoiled. Now, this story speaks, I think, to the relationship between who we are and what we learn. All of us are vessels for the Torah that we study, and the Torah we study fills us and assumes our shape, just as wine and indeed all liquids take the shape of their containers. And there's a sort of chemical reaction that takes place between who we are and what we learn. We are transformed by the Torah that we study, and the Torah we study is transformed by our encounter with it. It soon became clear to me how much I was being transformed by the Talmud I was studying. When I began learning, it was a very solitary pursuit. I would listen to podcasts of the daily page of Talmud. I don't even think there were podcasts then. It must have just been audio recordings, I suppose, on my computer alone in my studio apartment. The rabbis teach in the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin, source 2 on your source sheet, if a person is walking along his way, or her way, we might say, and has no companion, that person should occupy himself or herself with Torah study. And that's really what I did. Daf Yomi was my companion during what was otherwise a very lonely stretch of life. But as I soon learned, Daf Yomi is never really a solitary pursuit, because tens of thousands of people, if not more, right, learn Daf Yomi worldwide. And they're all literally on the same page, following the schedule fixed in 1923 in Poland by the founder of Daf Yomi, Rabbi Meir Shapira. Of course, the Talmud dates back almost 2,000 years, but the program of learning a page a day is only, well, almost a century old, I see. So you might say that Daf Yomi is kind of like the world's largest book club. And so when I was studying alone at home, I was essentially inhabiting this enormous virtual classroom filled with generations of scholars who'd studied that text before me, and further, who were sitting in the rows ahead of me, I imagined, and further along in the row where I was sitting to my right and to my left were other students of Talmud learning that same page that same day, elsewhere in Jerusalem, in Bnei Brak, in London, in Manhattan, in Muncie, surely in Norwalk as well. Everywhere in the world, there are people of the book. And when I realized this, that I was essentially inhabiting this virtual classroom, I was inspired to join a real Daf Yomi class that met at 6 a.m. at a local synagogue down the block from me. I was the only woman in the class, and I brought down the average age by about 30 years. I was also the only one who took notes. I scribbled fast and furiously in pencil in the margins of my volumes of Talmud, noting lines I wanted to remember, explanations offered by the rabbi who was teaching the class. I would summarize the arguments under discussion. I remember that the other men in the class used to tease me that I should write in pen because pencil might fade and maybe someday I would want to publish all these notes I was taking. Well, the truth is they didn't realize how prescient they were, and neither did I at the time. I began attending that class at the beginning of Seder Nashim. The Talmud is divided into not just 37 tractates, but those 37 tractates are organized into 6 orders, sort of large sections. And one of those orders is Seder Nashim. It's the part of the Talmud that deals with women, well, nominally women, but really marriage, procreation, divorce, wayward, adulterous wives and what to do with them, etc. I remember that sometimes it was a little awkward being the only woman in that class, not just because I was the only woman, but also because I was unmarried. And the Talmud looks pitifully upon unmarried women, unfortunately. They enter into elaborate discussions of women who have no wombs, women whose wombs are dormant because they haven't had children in 10 years. I remember how conspicuous I felt being the only womb, or having the only womb in the room, I should say. And whenever it was possible, I would always look ahead to the next page to see if I would be comfortable attending class the next morning. Over the course of that part of the Talmud, Siddur Nashim, the rabbis share many stories about difficult wives. Rav's wife would aggravate him by preparing lentils whenever he wanted peas for dinner, and vice versa. Rabbi Yossi Haglili's wife drove him so crazy that he borrowed money from a colleague so that he'd be able to afford to divorce her. Rabbi Chia's wife tricked him so that she wouldn't have to bear any more children. I remember that I found it really hard to identify with any of the women mentioned in these Talmudic stories, because even if they weren't as horrible or as unpleasant as their husbands made them out to be, they seem to spend most of their time sorting lentils, birthing children, I don't know, gossiping by the moonlight. I'm trying to think of the things that Talmudic women do. And none of these were activities that had any appeal to me at that time in my life. Instead, as someone who was then unmarried and had no children, I found myself identifying with the Talmudic rabbi Ben Azai, who was lambasted for his hypocrisy because he was a vocal champion of the importance of procreation, even though he himself had no children. And when he was called on this, he said, "What can I do? My soul desires Torah. Let the world be sustained by others." At that time, I was in the habit of going to different classes pretty much every night of the week, sometimes on the Parsha, sometimes Talmud classes. And my friends would encourage me to come out with them, to go to singles events, to go to parties, to go out and have fun. And I would just quote Ben Azai and say, "What can I do? My soul desires Torah." Well, eventually I did meet my husband, not at a party or a singles event, but at a Parsha class, of course. By that point, we had finished Seder Nashim, and we were already into the next part of the Talmud, Seder Nezikin. At the start of Tractate Bava Metzia, I convinced him to start learning Daf Yomi with me, and he too has been learning ever since. We got married in the middle of Bava Batra, the next tractate, and by the time we finished that Daf Yomi cycle, we had 3 children. Now we have 5. Our relationship has always been very different from that of most of the couples described in the Talmud. I definitely annoy him sometimes, like all those annoying wives, but I'm not the one who cooks for him while he goes off to study Torah. Certainly in the early years of our marriage, he did most of the cooking and cleaning, and I would keep him company by reading aloud from that day's page of Talmud. We would joke that we could get through half a page of Talmud in the time it took to fold a load of laundry. And that was really how we came to mark time in the number of pages we had learned. After our kids were born, we would come to the end of our learning, not at the bottom of the page for that day, but whenever the baby woke up. And then I would pick up in bed, learning as I was falling asleep, with the rabbis still arguing in my head about how late one could recite the bedtime Shema. And so you might say that I followed the Talmud, but the Talmud also followed me through the various twists and turns my life took, through divorce, Aliyah, dating, marriage, pregnancy, and motherhood, all of which unfolded against the backdrop of my daily Talmud study. T.S. Eliot famously wrote in his poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I have measured out my life in coffee spoons. Well, I think I've measured out my life in Talmudic tractates. I remember various experiences in my 20s and 30s based on what I was learning in Daf Yomi at the time. And I associate Talmudic passages with what was going on in my life when I learned them. So I want to give you one example of a story in the Talmud that I've learned in different ways depending on where I was in my life. And it's a very famous story. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It's the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave. It appears in Tractate Shabbat, the tractate I began my talk with today. I've now learned the story and the tractate of which it's a part twice. I've just completed my second cycle of Daf Yomi. The first time I learned it was 8 years ago when I returned from the hospital after giving birth to twin girls. I know that because they recently turned 8. And the second time I studied it was at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole story, although you have it on your source sheets if you'd like to look at it. I think what I'm going to do is, in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize the story for you and share with you how I read it during the 2 times the story in Daf Yomi. Now, so it's a story about this rabbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived during a time of Roman persecution when it was forbidden to study Torah. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai fled with his son to the Beit Midrash, to the study house, where they studied Torah in secret. The only one who knew where they were was Rabbi Shimon's wife. But soon Rabbi Shimon began to worry that maybe his wife would betray them to the Roman authorities, as he tells his son in the story, Nashim da'atan kala aleihen. Women are lightheaded. Women can't be trusted. And so, without telling his wife, he took his son and they fled to a cave where for 12 years they studied Torah together. According to the tradition, by the way, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is considered to be the author of the Zohar. That's not what academic scholars would say, but that's the traditional view. And the idea is that while he was in the cave with his son, he gained all these mystical insights, which enabled him to become the author of this great Kabbalistic text. Now, there are several strange and puzzling elements about this story in the Talmud. So the Talmud tells us that when Rabbi Shimon and his son were in the cave for 12 years, every day they would shed all their clothes and sit there buried up to their necks in sand, kind of like talking heads. And a miracle would occur for them. God created a carob tree and a spring of water that supplied all their nutritional needs. And when, at the end of those 12 years, they emerged from the cave, the Talmud relates, they found that the outside world was bright and blinding. They saw people running to and fro, going about their daily business, and they wondered to themselves, what could all these people possibly be rushing to? Don't forget, for 12 years, they had seen only each other in the dark light of the cave where they had learned together. Ultimately, they returned to the cave for an additional year of study, and Rabbi Shimon looked at his son and said, the world is enough with me and with you. Now, as I said, I first came upon this story 8 years ago, early in my maternity leave, when I was holed up at home with my newborn twins. It was the dead of winter, so I rarely left the house, nor did I bother to get dressed in the morning. I just wore the same sweatpants day after day. I remember thinking that I was essentially buried up to my neck in sand. My life consisted of an endless cycle of breastfeeding, diaper changing, and of course, trying to keep up with my daily Talmud study. I remember thinking that I was the carob tree and the spring of water and the study partner all rolled up into one. And on those rare occasions when I did manage to leave the house, bundling up my girls and packing them into their double stroller, I too would leave the house and feel like the harsh light of day was bewildering and blinding. I would see people running to catch a bus or get to work on time, and I would think to myself, What are they rushing to? What could possibly be so important? And then I would come back home and I would unbundle the girls and I would sigh in weary elation. And I would speak those same words that Rabbi Shimon said to his son, "The world is enough with me and with you." Now, before I move on to my second reading of this story, I just want to, for a moment, address the feminist element in this story. As you can imagine, this story is often dismissed as yet another example of rabbinic misogyny. After all, the whole reason Rabbi Shimon and his son flee to the cave is because Rabbi Shimon thinks he can't trust his wife. Women are lightheaded. This becomes even more pronounced when we consider the story in its halachic context. In the second chapter of Tractate Shabbat, sandwiched between the Mishnah about the 3 sins for which women are punished in childbirth, and the Mishnah about what a husband must remind his wife to do in her Shabbat preparations, as if this entire section of Talmud is overshadowed by a fear of women's flightiness and sinfulness. But when I first encountered this story in my first Daf Yomi cycle, I didn't identify with Rabbi Shimon's lightheaded and frivolous wife. I really identified with Rabbi Shimon, engaged in an active, intimate study with his child. For me, this story was above all a powerful articulation of maternal bonding, of that stage in which a mother is as close to her child as when that child was still a part of her. And indeed, the more I learn, the more it becomes clear to me that by the Talmud standards, I'm a man rather than a woman, if man is defined as an independent, self-sufficient adult, whereas a woman is a dependent, generally living in either her father's or her husband's home. In some ways, this has been a relief because I can regard the Talmud's gender stereotypes as historical curiosities and not infuriating provocations. The Talmud doesn't offend me because I'm defying its classifications through my very engagement with the text. So many of the classical interpretations of the Talmud reflect gendered assumptions, and these texts have the potential to take on radically new meaning when regarded through women's eyes. Like the cave of Bar Yochai, which is traditionally regarded as a sort of kollel or yeshiva in a cave where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son hide away and immerse themselves in their learning, devoid of all worldly concerns. Bar Yochai privileges the devotional over the political. He studies as a way of retreating from the world and disdains what he refers to as temporal life, the life of this world. But I use my learning about Bar Yochai's dark cave and so much of my other learning too, to shed light on my experiences outside the study house and in the world. For me, Bar Yochai's cave became a metaphor for my maternity leave and for other experiences as well. And its manifold interpretive possibilities help me find meaning in my own experiences. So to give a second example of the multiple meanings this text has had for me, as I said, I came to the story a second time in my second and most recent Daf Yomi cycle a year and a half ago during the early months of the coronavirus pandemic. At the time, I identified with Bar Yochai because I too was holed up in my home with only my family members, afraid to go out into the wider world. Just as Bar Yochai's world contracted into the space of the cave, my whole world seemed to have contracted into the space of our Jerusalem apartment. Like the carob tree and the stream and the spring of water that miraculously appeared for Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, we too began getting our food in new ways. Instead of going out to the supermarket, everything we needed miraculously appeared on our doorstep, or at least that's how it looked to my kids who weren't with us when we placed the supermarket order on our computers and typed in our credit card information. Like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, my kids and I spent a lot of time studying together. Past before the pandemic, they would go off to school and I would head off to the library and sit and do my work. But now we were all home and they were on school and Zoom, but they couldn't always ask their teachers their questions. So I became their study partner, helping them to find the books they needed, practice the multiplication tables, study for their spelling tests, answer questions about Abraham and Sarah for their test on Sefer Breshit. The nice thing about Zoom school and about working from home is that you don't have to get properly dressed in the morning. And sometimes we really did feel like Bar Yochai and his son, never bothering to put on real clothes because, hey, who wants to do laundry on top of everything else we were dealing with? But making sure we looked respectable enough to daven every morning, which the kids did, often on WhatsApp video with their teachers. It was an intense period, but we also enjoyed the togetherness. Sometimes I would look at our Shabbat table, always set with enough places for only our immediate family, and I would tell myself that my husband and kids and I would have to suffice for the entire world. Like Bar Yochai and his son, who emerged from the cave and then were sent back and then emerged again after that additional year of studying, my kids have had multiple returns to school and to the outside world. We've had 3 different lockdowns in Israel, each of which was followed by a reopening of the schools. Each time the decree of the lockdown restrictions was lifted, my kids had a very hard time going back. Their first return was especially fearsome and fraught. On our walk to school, the kids couldn't believe that not everyone around them was wearing a mask. Where's your mask? My son would ask me about passersby, and I thought of Bar Yochai's son, who, when he first emerges from the cave, and you'll see this if you read the full story, which I only summarized for you, he burns up the world around him with his eyes because he's so not used to seeing the outside world. Eventually, I came to appreciate that everyone was dealing with this pandemic as best they could. I don't know if our minds have been set at ease, as eventually happens with Bar Yochai in this story, but hopefully as more and more of the population is vaccinated and the lockdown restrictions are lifted once again, now for the 3rd time, we're getting closer to that point. Now, both of these readings that I share with you of this story, the maternity leave reading and the coronavirus reading, you could say, are both very personal readings of the Talmud, of the Talmudic text. But that's really how I've always studied Talmud. Throughout my study of Talmud, I've always taken copious notes. I filled the margins of my volumes of Talmud with notes, not just about what I was learning, but also about how what I was learning resonated with what was going on in the rest of my life, and especially in the life of my family. When I had more to say than could fit in the margins of the volumes of my Talmud, I began writing journal entries. I kept an anonymous blog. I never dreamed that any of this material would ever be published. And so in my writing, I was very open and bold because I was writing really only for myself. But then after my twins were born, at the end of my maternity leave, I began thinking about maybe collecting all this material to prepare for completing my first cycle of Daf Yomi. By that point, the notes I had taken and the essays I had written had become so much a part of how I understood the Talmudic text that I could not possibly omit them from my discussion. The events of my personal life served to illuminate the text and to make an argument for a way of reading the text and a way of reading Jewish sources in which the text is a commentary on life and life is a commentary on the text. And so they became part of the book I eventually published, If All the Seas Were Ink, which is at once a memoir and an introduction of sorts to the Babylonian Talmud. The title of my book, If All the Seas Were Ink, here, this is the book, is a reference to a trope that appears throughout rabbinic literature. I first encountered it not in the Talmud, but in the Midrash in Shir Hashirim Rabbah, which I learned with a friend in a cafe in Jerusalem over the course of many, many Tuesday afternoons. The Midrash quotes Rabbi Eliezer, who says, this is source 8 on your source sheet, if all the seas were ink and all the reeds were pens, and all the heaven and the earth were scrolls, and all of mankind were scribes, they would not suffice to write all the Torah which I have learned. And yet I have diminished no more from it than a man would take by dipping a vial into the sea. But Rabbi Akiva, his student, Rabbi Eliezer's student, puts it a bit differently. He says that his learning from his teacher has been like someone who smells the fragrant scent of an etrog. The etrog is not diminished at all, because of what he has smelled. Rabbi Akiva also compares the study of Torah to lighting one lamp from another. The first lamp does not lose any of its brightness when it kindles the second. These sources capture for me the infinite nature of Torah study. Torah is as vast as the sea, and each time we learn, we are taking in only as much as could fill a small vial dipped into a vast ocean. And yet Torah is infinite. So when we study Torah, we do not diminish Torah. We are rather increasing and replenishing the beauty and light in the world. Now, I was trying to see where to go. So many more things I want to say. Well, I guess okay. So I should say, I want to say one more thing about the personal nature of the book, and that is the book I published is a very personal reading of the Talmud, sort of reading the text against the backdrop of my life, and therefore at once a memoir and a book about Talmud. But I really do believe that to engage with Jewish texts deeply, you really have to have this personal connection. The Talmudic sage Rabbi Yossi teaches in Tractate Sota, words of Torah can only be fully learned by one who makes himself naked before them. Rabbi Yossi is generally understood as meaning that if you want to study Torah fully, you have to strip yourself of preconceived notions and start anew. But I read it differently. To me, it seems that the most meaningful way to study Torah is to search for the interconnections and the resonances between Torah and the rest of one's life, so that to study Torah, you really have to be willing to bare your soul and to make yourself vulnerable. You have to summon the courage to let the text resonate in the darkest recesses of your soul, in the hope that the text will illuminate your soul, and your soul, in turn, will illuminate the text. I bared much of my soul in my book, but I hope that doing so will inspire others to read their own lives into the text of our tradition and to incorporate those texts into their lives. And in my study of Talmud and in the book I published, I also incorporated a lot of other literary sources from other literatures that I read. When I began learning, I found myself wanting to find a way of remembering how much I was learning, because I was learning so quickly. It was almost like, I thought of it as like zooming through a safari on a motorbike. Like there was so much to take in and you could barely keep pace. So I began writing a poem, a limerick for every page of Talmud I studied, sort of as a mnemonic device. And now I have hundreds of these limericks, and I remember many of them by heart, and they're a way that I've been able to retain some of what I've learned. These poems, I'm happy to share them in the Q&A if you're interested, but I won't read poetry to you now. These poems really speak to how I read the Talmud as a literary text. As someone who reads a lot of poetry, I couldn't help but hear echoes of the poems I loved when studying Talmud. And I think this is in part because Talmudic stories are written in very concise literary units in which no detail is extraneous and meaning is very rarely transparent. You have to tease out meaning, as you do with poetry. And so maybe it's not surprising that I heard echoes of Shakespeare's double, double, toil and trouble from Macbeth in the rabbi's discussion of how to cure leprosy by boiling a pot filled with various exotic ingredients. I heard Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death in the rabbi's discussion of the sage who kept learning so that the angel of death would not be able to snatch his soul, and that's 1 second he stopped learning. And I heard Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn in the rabbinic discussion of the relationship between beauty and transience. Given that I heard so much poetry in the Talmud, it didn't seem like too much of a stretch to begin writing poetry about the Talmud I was learning. The poetry I wrote about the Talmud was really my way to rewrite Torah for myself, which is in fact an explicit rabbinic command in Tractate Sanhedrin of the Talmud. The rabbis teach in that tractate, which is about the administration of justice in a Jewish state. They teach in the second chapter, which is about the role of the king. They teach that amidst the laws of how the king must conduct himself, based on Parshat Shoftim in the book of Deuteronomy, the king must write his own Torah scroll. And at this point, the Talmudic sage Rava comments, Even if one's ancestors have left him a scroll of the Torah, he still must write one for himself. And the Talmud explains that every king has to actually write 2 Torah scrolls, one that he carries with him everywhere he goes and functions as a sort of amulet that he wears on his arm, the Talmud says, and one that he keeps at home in his treasury. And when I read this source, when I encountered this source in Daf Yomi, I said, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I do, because everywhere I go, I take my iPhone with me. And anytime I have a free second, I turn on a podcast and listen to a Daf Yomi class. That's my portable Torah, so to speak. But I also have my full set of Talmud volumes at home, which I study when I'm learning at home. And so I really identified with this source. As someone who never travels without the volume of Talmud I'm learning, I always hate going on trips if we're in between tractates because I have to carry with me 2 volumes of Talmud. When I first started learning Daf Yomi, I would try to learn as soon as I woke up. And if I couldn't learn right when I woke up, I would force myself to carry my volume of Talmud with me so that I could learn whenever I had a spare moment, and the extra weight would remind me of my obligation. Well, all that has changed now because with children, there's way too much paraphernalia to carry around. But I really do think of my phone as my portable Torah, as my amulet. And I think that learning Torah, as is the king has commanded, is about rewriting it for oneself. And that's kind of how I regard my project in writing my memoir. And yet, and I'll conclude with this, it took me a really long time to learn that lesson, to learn the lesson that I had something to say, to write and to say about the Talmud that other people might want to hear. When I think back to that all-male Daf Yomi class that I used to sit in on over a decade ago, I realized that that lesson was really not apparent to me then. Though I attended that class for nearly 2 years, I almost never opened my mouth. I thought to myself, well, everyone around me in this classroom has been studying Talmud for years. What could I possibly have to contribute to a discussion that's been unfolding for 2,000 years? I'm reminded of a story in Tractate Chagiga about that same Rabbi Yoshua I mentioned earlier, the ugly rabbi who had the conversation with the daughter of the Roman emperor. The Talmud relates that Rabbi Yoshua once sent 2 of his students to go learn with another rabbi in his academy. And when those students came back to their teacher, Rabbi Yoshua, asked them, what did you learn? What did you learn? What new insight can you share with me? And his students looked at him like he was crazy. They said to him, we are your students. We drink from your waters. What could we possibly have to tell you, Rabbi Yoshua, that you don't already know? And Rabbi Yoshua looked at his students gravely and said, there can be no encounter with Torah that does not produce new Torah. Anytime you engage with the text of our tradition, you will come up with new insights. You may think that it's because it's your first time reading a particular text or even opening a volume of Talmud that you can't possibly have anything original to share. But as someone who teaches, I can say that it is often those who view the text through fresh eyes who make the most valuable contributions. No 2 people read the text in the same way. No one person reads the text in the same way at different points in his or her life, as I tried to show you earlier. And so, encouraged by their teacher, Rabbi Yoshua's students shared that they had learned the following teaching. Make your ears into a funnel to receive Torah, they told their teacher. You have to make yourself receptive to Torah so that Torah fills you and shapes you and assumes your shape. When Rabbi Yoshua heard this, he said to his students, you had this precious pearl of wisdom and you were going to deprive me of it? Each of us has precious pearls of wisdom to share with others. Each of us can assume a seat that can be occupied by no one else in the communal enterprise of studying the text of our tradition. Each of us has a life that can enrich the text, and each of us has been given a rich, vast, infinite textual heritage that can enrich our lives. May the world merit to be enriched by the words of Torah inside each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana. Yesher koach. Everyone, feel free to use your Zoom reactions to show your love for Ilana. or your old school reactions. Wow, what a journey you have been on for so long. And I remember one of the years when I lived in Jerusalem going to shul with you, and you did always have a volume of Gemara sitting in a big tote bag. So it's been a long time. Amazing. And I know so many people in the world have benefited from reading your memoir / intro to Talmud, including several of the people who are here with us today from Congregation Bethel. So we do have a couple of questions that people have asked. And if you would like to chat me a question to ask Ilana, feel free to put that in the chat right now. I'm going to ask the first question comes from David Lowenberg, who is someone who has read your book, knows who you are, suggested that we bring you as our teacher today. And David wants to know, for those of us who don't have the Hebrew or Aramaic language skills to learn Talmud, how do you recommend that someone start Talmud study, particularly Daf Yomi?
Okay, so I would say, well, I guess in the title of my book, I use the metaphor of the sea, right? To refer to the Talmud, which is in fact a metaphor the rabbis use as well, Yam HaHalacha, the sea of Jewish law. And I sort of feel like, as with an ocean, where you can swim on various levels, right? You can just skim the surface, right? You can dive down deeply, right? You can swim deep underwater, or you can become a deep sea diver and get to know all the flora and fauna on the ocean floor. The Talmud is kind of like that. I think you can access it on many, many different levels, and get something out of it on different levels. Not everyone has to learn Talmud at the rate of a page a day. There's a wonderful program run by the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem where I teach, called Daf Shvu'i, where you learn one page of Talmud every week, divided into every page of Talmud is divided into 6 very manageable sections that you learn 6 days a week, not 7 like Daf Yomi. You actually get Shabbat off in Daf Shvu'i, and it comes with a commentary online, all free and available to the public, written by a wonderful scholar of Talmud, Dr. Joshua Cope. So I really recommend that program. I also think that if you find a good teacher and listening to a Daf Yomi podcast, even if you don't fully understand everything, if you're an English speaker, you listen in English, right? You'll get out of it what you will get out of it. I never studied Aramaic. Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew, and my Hebrew was pretty good, and I just kept very, very, very extensive vocabulary lists whenever I learned. And, with time, everything begins to sound familiar. And the nice thing about the Talmud is there's a lot of repetition. So if you don't understand something the first time, you might understand it the second time. And if not the second time, then hopefully the third. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you. I'll also toss in, and maybe you want to talk about this for a second also, that it's available in English just online now. I think you mentioned Sefaria before. Do you want to say anything about that translation?
Yeah, there's a wonderful website called Sefaria, SEFARIA.com, which has many, many, many traditional Jewish texts available in the original language and also in translation. I use it all the time for writing Divrei Torah. It's a really, really valuable resource. You can search. So you can study Talmud in English on this website for Sefaria.org. Yeah, for example. So yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Wonderful. I've got another question for you. This one comes from the president of our congregation, David Hirschfield. Hey, David. And David wants to know how you would describe your own Jewish affiliation on the spectrum of Masorti to wherever you are. Of course, you referenced before that you grew up going to a Solomon Schechter school in the States, and I don't know how many people here know, but I know that you come from a long line of conservative rabbi people in your family. So where have you ended up religiously?
So I feel like I haven't really traveled very far. So I grew up in the conservative movement, in a conservative shul, in an observant home, keeping Shabbat and Kashrut. And I have to say that the nice thing about living in Jerusalem is that you can most people are a part of many different shul communities. No matter where you daven, there are several shuls on every block. So you're likely to, wherever you're going to daven, pass a few shuls along the way. We now daven in a minyan that meets 5 minutes from our house, and we pass 2 other minyanim on the way to get there. It's all 5 minutes away. So I would say for me, it's hard to say, like, the denominations don't really have any meaning in Israel, or not in the same way. But I remain observant. Keeping Shabbat and kashrut is very important for me. That my children are raised that way. However they end up, who knows? And I would say that as a feminist, I think that very much informs my, like, I daven in egalitarian shuls. I read Torah now, especially in Corona, pretty much every Shabbat. And that's been a very important part of my religious experience. In fact, throughout most of this pandemic, my husband and I have split the parshiot and each read half of them, which means that there's a lot of Torah learning happening all the time in our house, and our kids find it really, really annoying. We're always chanting. And when I teach for the conservative yeshiva, in a way, that's a very important institutional affiliation for me. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I don't really know the answer, but
yeah, that's amazing. And that's
just a quick follow-up. What sort of schools do your children attend?
So our kids go to a Dati Leumi school, like a religious Zionist school, I guess you could say. It's a school where, it's considered, like, in Israel, there's the religious school system and then the secular school system. So they're in the religious system. So they study Torah. We live in Baka, which is a very, sort of a diverse and there's a very diverse and liberal religious life. So it's a religious school, but girls can wear pants, which is not the case in most religious schools in Israel. And girls and boys learn all the same things in school. And for the most part, I haven't encountered any, it's very rare that my kids say anything that bring home anything from school that bothers me, in terms of feminist issues, and never politically. So I feel like that's been a very good choice for them and for our family.
Thanks, Ilana. Louise just asked in the chat to everyone, I don't know if you see her question come up. She says, I've heard that many Israelis are vegan. I find that keeping kashrut is easier by not eating meat. Did you study I assume in your Talmud study, did you study anything about this?
Well, that's interesting. So I'm a vegetarian. Actually, I have a whole chapter in my book about being vegetarian as it relates to my Talmud study. So you're welcome to read that chapter. But I write about vegetarianism and compare it to kashrut in terms of what it, like, the nature of different dietary restrictions and how they shape the way we think about eating and food. I think it's a lot easier to keep kosher in Israel than I have secular friends who hoard bread before Pesach because it's impossible to find it in the supermarkets, and they find that really annoying. So in some ways it's easier to keep kosher here than not. So I guess I just have that luxury. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I would like to know if you have, from all of these tractates that you've learned twice through now, is there a tractate that is your very favorite?
So usually it's whatever tractate I'm learning at that point, because it's preoccupying me and it just becomes so interesting because it's what I'm focused on. I'm actually now, so I'm on Yoma, which is the first tractate I ever learned. And so I'm learning it now for the third time, having just completed my second cycle. And I do think it is one of my favorites. Yoma is about Yom Kippur, but specifically about the avodah service, sort of everything the high priest did in the temple on Yom Kippur. And the tractate is sort of like a guided tour of the temple through the eyes of the high priest. And I'm fascinated by all the romance and all the lore of Talmudic rituals. And I write about that romance a lot in my book, in the opening, in the first chapter. So yeah, I would say probably Yoma it's definitely up there.
Awesome. Wendy would like to know if you are currently teaching anything. And I know you referenced that you're teaching at the conservative yeshiva. So maybe you could tell us what you teach there.
So I teach for the yeshiva this year. I've been writing for them instead of teaching because of Corona. They didn't have any students come this year. So I've been writing a weekly Dvar Torah column in which every week I write about a passage in the Talmud that relates to that week's Torah portion. So if you go on the website of the conservative yeshiva, you can find that. But I will in September again, God willing, go back to teaching, and I'm supposed to teach a course that I've taught once before. I think I taught it once before, yeah. And the course, basically what I do is I teach one passage from every tractate of the Talmud and show how that passage is representative of the tractate as a whole. And I call the class an aerial tour of the Talmud, because we sort of get like a bird's eye view of the whole Talmud, but also zoom in on one particular passage from every Masechet, from every tractate. So that's what I'll be teaching again, God willing, in September. Yeah. And I also teach Agadah. I teach the sort of literary as opposed to the halachic parts of rabbinic sources. I teach Agadah and Midrash also.
Cool. Well, everyone, I just dropped the link to the conservative yeshiva website into the chat. And this is a great resource for conservative Jews, both for their online learning. And if anyone is interested in ever spending some time in Jerusalem, I know that the time that I was a student there were people from the States who were spending a couple of months or a month or a summer or a winter break renting an apartment in Jerusalem and studying there. So that would be an awesome thing as well. I have one last question here that I'd like to ask before we wrap up. And I'm going to ask Linda and Steve's question before that, and then we'll thank you and let you go off to bed. So the Steins would like to know if you were ever a soldier in the IDF.
Oh no, because I made Aliyah too late in life. I was 26 when I came to Israel, and especially as a woman, that was way too late.
Yeah, super old.
Yeah.
So I guess the last question for today will be, do you aspire for your children to join you and your husband in learning Daf Yomi? And if so, what do you envision that looking like?
I have no idea. I've learned not to, certainly not to share any of my aspirations with them, because they will just do the opposite. So I try not to say anything. But I hope that they will, like when all of my kids were little, I studied while putting them to sleep, while nursing them. Like they all grew up hearing words of Torah. And when they can't fall asleep at night, we give them two choices. One is the multiplication tables, to drill the multiplication tables. Number two is to hear us practicing our laning, our Torah reading. So they certainly hear a lot of Torah. Will they ever want to learn Daf Yomi? I have no idea. I'd be thrilled if they wanted to, but I certainly am not going to suggest it.
Maybe you should tell them that they should never do it, so then they'll stop.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of our entire congregation, I want to thank you so much for being our guest teacher today in memory of William GROSSMAN. Just amazing to hear your story, and particularly as you move the reflections from your book into the last year of all of our crazy lives. It's very meaningful and very powerful to hear that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody,
thank you
for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Laila Tov, Ilana. And we'll see all of you guys soon.
Thank you.
Sit down. Come on.